President Obama came into office and concluded that, as in Africa, in China, the Bush administration had not left a wreck behind, that there was something on which to build a foundation for further progress. And moreover, he had campaigned on the promise of addressing the global financial crisis, global climate change, and non-proliferation issues, including Iran and North Korea. You can't solve those problems without getting China involved. He wanted to test the waters to see how much China could cooperate on these without getting into the backs and forth of the difficult issues we have first. And he scheduled a summit meeting in China for the end of 2009 to push his agenda with the Chinese. And the early indications were there'd be some progress. And in fact, on the financial crisis, there was considerable progress. China did a lot to stimulate their economy and provide global growth. Problems are arising now, but that happens. Second was climate change. And there, China moved more than we expected in terms of promising to enhance energy efficiency. But in the final analysis at Copenhagen, it was a pretty messy process, and the outcome was very, very weak, and maybe even weaker as time goes on. The third area was nuclear nonproliferation, and there China helped get North Korea back into talks with the United States and back them down from some of their more provocative stances, which is a good thing, but it's not the end of the road. We have a long way to go. And on Iran, China has previously been sort of hiding behind Russia. Russia was the one that sort of stood in the way of sanctions on Iran to try to move the Iranian government out of their nuclear weapons program. Now Russia has modified its position, and China looms large as the most important impediment to putting tougher sanctions on Iran. Those are positives and negatives that have emerged over the year. To get to that point, a number of sensitive issues in U.S.-China relations were postponed so that there would be no diplomatic impediment. The time to deal with those is now. That's arms sales to Taiwan, which is a long-standing American commitment that Mr. Obama cannot avoid. And secondly, a meeting with the Dalai Lama, which every president has done since 1990. Dalai Lama to China represents a sensitive subject where they had riots a couple of years ago, and a crackdown still continues in Tibet. And the Dalai Lama is the spiritual and natural political leader of Tibet. And so they're sensitive to Obama's meeting with the Dalai Lama here in Washington. The United States has, since 1979, when we recognized the People's Republic of China as the legitimate government of China, has had a very ambiguous stance on the status of Taiwan. And part of that has been to help reinforce Taiwan's autonomy from China by maintaining a sufficient self-defense capability that China will not be able to easily coerce Taiwan into doing what it doesn't want to do. And to that end, every administration has sold weapons to Taiwan at various points to help them make their self-defense. And there was some unfinished business left over from the Bush administration, and it's come up for Obama. Obama has waited until after his own visit to China to make some decisions about what are largely, or in fact purely, defensive systems. Missile defenses, anti-submarine mine vessels, some missiles to shoot down incoming aircraft and missiles, anti-air missiles, and some helicopters, Black Hawk helicopters, which are useful both for combat over waters near Taiwan and also for humanitarian purposes in storms and rescue situations. And China has reacted pretty strongly to this. One of the features of this decision is that it's been mulled sort of openly for 6 months. And China's a new and more open society in many ways. They have new journals, they've got a very active internet population, and on those, lots of opinions have been expressed about how to deter the U.S. from making further sales of arms to Taiwan, or how to punish the U.S. if it does make sales. And so we've seen a lot of heated rhetoric, and it's shown up in our own media reflecting the strength of opinion held by ordinary people in China. But I detect in the response from China, on the one hand, a need to placate their domestic opinion with strong sentiment, but at the same time to manage this issue so it doesn't get out of control. And so the language used in the protests from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was slightly modified over the language of the last protest they gave in 2008, before we had a very nice 2009 in U.S.-China relations. I think after a period, we will get back to a better relationship. But we're probably going to slide down a little farther in our relationship because we have an upcoming meeting between the President and His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And China won't like that either, and that'll further feed the emotional rhetoric coming out of China. As I say, though, I see the Chinese officials trying to hold a steady hand and not allow this to spill out of control. Of course, with emotions running high, things can spill out of control. Unintended events can take us there. It's encouraging that officials both here and in China are trying to anticipate that and keep this from spilling over into a bigger impact on our broader U.S.-China relationship. The Google case is a really interesting case in China. There's been a lot of pressure on Google not to participate as a search engine in China because Chinese law requires self-censorship by the search engine companies. And Google was doing self-censorship according to Chinese law, but was uncomfortable with it and had a trial period. Then Google says, and has shown evidence, that they were hacked seriously. Not only they, but 32 other companies had their source code stolen by entities, which looked like they came from China, although you can't really take a smoking gun into court and prove it. And then there's a human rights issue, which is that some of the human rights activists in China have had their Gmail assessed through the Google system. And all of these got jumbled together in Google's protest, but Google said they're going to stop working as a Chinese search engine. Therefore, they won't have to abide by Chinese law to conduct censorship. But they would like to stay in China and see if they could find a negotiated arrangement to keep gmail.com working in China, and also to introduce a couple new telephones that they have got as a system to sell in China. And there's some other businesses as well, research, and there's quite a few people working for them. In the first instance, China's reaction to Google's statement, because it lumped together so many commercial, human rights, and technical issues, they were pretty angry. But within days, you could see Chinese officials calling this a commercial matter, not a political matter, and trying to contain it, which suggested they were prepared to sit down and try to negotiate with Google. But then, quite coincidentally, Secretary Clinton gave a speech on internet freedom, which seemed to once again politicize the issue, although that was, as I understand it, not the intent of the administration. But nonetheless, the reaction in China was this was politicization. But again, I saw the hand of officials trying to keep this from getting out of control. A statement was posted by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesman on a bulletin board. He was asked questions about this issue repeatedly at a press conference and declined to stir it up anymore. So I think China is still in a negotiating mode, and I suspect Google is too, and some of this will sort itself out. I think there's a need for public education on internet matters. The vulnerability all of us have to internet hacking, the privacy issues, security issues, and also internet infrastructure. China is building a far more advanced infrastructure that will allow hackers to operate from China. This is not the intent of the infrastructure, but the result is that hackers can operate from China pretty much without being caught. And we are, in the United States, on an older infrastructure system known as Internet Protocol version 4, unlike version 6, which China has, which is more limited. It's private sector. It doesn't have big government hand guiding policy. But it makes us more vulnerable than we need to be. And we ought to be having a discussion here in this country about upgrading our infrastructure to protect us better. Well, I think China at Copenhagen really took a hit to its reputation. They had scored points in December by saying that they were going to reduce the energy intensity of their productivity to by 45% by 2020. And they're still saying they're going to do that. The efforts to codify this, to provide verification mechanisms, seem to set China off, and a lot of the other G77 countries who don't want to be held to standards as high as Europe and the United States might seek them to hold. And so we had a mess in terms of objectives, and And it was also a very poorly run meeting. And so lots of things started to happen. Timing of meetings fell apart, participation issues arose. We had heated arguments. China had its environmental minister pointing his finger and yelling at President Obama, which didn't do China any good. On the other hand, one doesn't want to draw the direst conclusions from this. There were lots of reasons this didn't go well. And I think some of the media play about China, not to defend China in particular, but some of the media play just took the issue farther than the facts would allow. The Dalai Lama and the cause of Tibet enjoy very special status in the U.S., has a long history. We've had a history of having CIA cooperation and support for the Dalai Lama. That ended in the Nixon administration. It's a long time now. And most Americans support the Dalai Lama as a revered religious leader and believe that Tibetans were promised and should receive greater autonomy within China's borders, not challenging the sovereignty of China over Tibet, but how Tibet is governed. And the Chinese have reacted to this very badly. They see Tibet in a different light. They believe they've been overly generous to the Tibetan people, and they've been, in return, ungrateful to Chinese investments in their area. They're really talking past each other. A lot of experts watch from the outside and wish China would make some adjustments in its policy to give greater economic, social, and other benefits and relaxation to the lives of the people in Tibet. And as a symbol of that American support, the Dalai Lama has been received by American presidents since 1990, when I was the first person to escort the Dalai Lama in to meet President George H.W. Bush. The Dalai Lama is not exploiting these meetings for political effect. He's treated as a revered religious leader. We have urged China, the United States has urged China to get into talks with his representatives. And surprisingly enough, they did just last week have a meeting with their representatives. Once again, it went nowhere, unfortunately. But this time, at least, it wasn't as rancorous a departure from Beijing by the representatives as it was the previous time. So the Dalai Lama's visits are something that's part of the fabric of our relationship with China. China rejects that, objects very strongly. China will probably react by declining to send their president to an upcoming meeting here in Washington of the Nuclear Security Conference Summit, and they'll send someone lower level a signal of their unhappiness with the United States, as they would put it, interfering in their core interests in Tibet as well as in Taiwan. China's currency and trade disputes are interrelated, sometimes lumped together wrongly, sometimes put together rightly in public discussions here. China is producing far more than it can consume, so that's going to turn up in the international marketplace. And where it does, people are going to object, saying they're dumping, they're disrupting natural markets for other countries, and we're going to have trade disputes. China is also keeping the value of its renminbi currency low because they want to, in a time of financial strife around the world, they want to keep their workers working in their factories. And what we need is some harmony around the world on everybody sacrificing a little bit. But that doesn't usually happen. What usually happens is you have trade disputes, especially in periods of high unemployment as we have in the industrial West. The disputes between the United States and China are growing, and they're going to grow, I think, exponentially as we approach the elections of later 2010. In Europe, they're actually worse. Europe's currency gap, the euro's gap with the renminbi, is even larger than the dollar gap. Now, a separate issue, but related, is that the United States has a legislative requirement to, by April 15 every year, the Treasury Department should determine who are people manipulating currency, which countries are manipulating currency. And we have that deadline coming up this April. I believe, from the small but important signs you get from Chinese financial authorities, that they're in the process of adjusting the value of their currency modestly, but enough so that they can duck being labeled manipulators by the April 15 deadline. That means probably something like 3 to 5% upward adjustment of their currency vis-a-vis the dollar. And that probably will take some of the steam out of the heat in the U.S., but it's not going to eliminate it, because election year, high unemployment, and trade mismatches just naturally have us grinding together in ways that will have to be dealt with by professional trade negotiators and lawyers in the usual forums of the World Trade Organization or bilaterally. China has got a long-standing history with Iran, where they were, for a long time, had nothing to do with Iran, and then the United States urged them to get involved in 1979, just before the fall of the Shah of Iran. And it's been a complicated relationship ever since. They supplied weapons that we were worried about through the 1980s and 90s, and they then stopped supplying some of those weapons. They were helping the nuclear and missile programs, we believe, but then they backed away from doing that. But China now has very important commercial interests. It imports a lot of petroleum. I believe Iran is their #2 source of petroleum after Saudi Arabia. And they have contracts which would allow them to exploit gas and oil fields that are very, very large. These are contracts only. They haven't become investments yet. As Iran gets isolated, China's position in those investments actually improves. So to a certain extent, in China's internal deliberations, the petroleum and gas sector, the energy sector, may outweigh the Ministry of Foreign Affairs when it says we're getting in trouble with the U.S. and we're creating tensions in the Persian Gulf, and other interests say, hey, we want the oil, it's ours to have. I'm not privy to their internal arguments, but that's how I think that it goes on. I think also that China has linked Iran and its behavior with respect to Iran and North Korea to our behavior toward Taiwan. They would like to put pressure on us to reduce our arms sales and adjust our relationship with Taiwan in exchange for cooperation. I think cooperation is something that is not completely impossible in international sanctions on Iran, but China has one, as I mentioned, the economic aspect, and two, the manipulative diplomatic use of Iran as a ploy. The U.S. has been trying to convey to China that this is a core interest of ours, that it's a very dangerous part of the world, and that if this isn't handled right, we could end up interrupting everybody's supply of oil out of the Persian Gulf. So far, that hasn't persuaded the Chinese, and we had a test just on January 17 when China had its foreign minister invited to a conference on the next round of sanctions in New York, and they chose to send an officer from the mission at the United Nations. I think that signaled that China is not going to play a cooperative role, or it may not play an obstructive role, but it's not going to play a cooperative role in the upcoming UN sessions. Even though this 2010 starts out with quite a few disputes between the United States and China and some rising emotions in both places, we do constitute an indispensable pair of nations. We're not a pair of nations that can get together and govern the world as a G2, but there's almost no problem that's transnational that doesn't require the U.S. and China to somehow work together. And the world's not going away. This current downturn in relations will be followed by a need to work on pragmatic, practical, tough issues. And it starts with the Nuclear Security Summit on proliferation concerns in April. China probably will not be cooperative then, or very cooperative. But then we get into the spring. We have a G20 meeting with China and the U.S. and the other. It's not 20 anymore, it's not 24 entities, but it's the G24 will meet in Toronto, and there'll be financial issues to discuss at that time and maybe take some action. And then later in the year, we'll be meeting, again, the G20 will meet in Korea with Seoul as host. And then the APEC meeting, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, will meet in Japan. And the presidents of both countries will be there, and they'll have issues to work on. And we have a vast array of issues going down the road to 2012, and the departure of China's current president, Hu Jintao, from office, and the effort by Mr. Obama to get himself reelected in that year, elections in Taiwan, a lot of things going on. And the U.S. and China will just have to keep working together on this and get through the emotions and deal with realities.